This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 76. The real answer to the affordable housing issue.
Hello, I'm Phil Dobbie, and today on the Debunking Economics Podcast, the Chancellor of the Exchequer has decided he wants to do something about housing affordability, and in his budget this week, he's decided to do exactly the wrong things. So today we look at why getting rid of stamp duty will have precisely the wrong effect, and what should Philip Hammond do to fix housing affordability. Well, if you're buying a house in Britain for the first time, one that costs less than £500,000, well, your stamp duty will no longer be charged on £300,000 of that cost. Now, bearing in mind that stamp duty doesn't apply for the first £125,000 anyway, it means your maximum supposed saving is £5,000. That's a 1% saving on the cost of your £500,000 home. So even if that was to work and that saving didn't mean house prices rise to soak up all of that money, so the money actually goes from being revenue for the government to revenue for the seller of the home, even if that wasn't the case and it just made lots of homes 1% cheaper, is it really going to make much of a difference? After all, the average house price in the UK is now £223,000, an almost 5% increase over the last year. So there we are, that's that 1% saving wiped out straight away. And £482,000 is the average price for London. But there again, Steve, being devil's advocate for the moment, London house prices are falling. So does that actually show that maybe the market is working, that London has peaked and people are now buying cheaper houses elsewhere?
Yeah, I know. London house prices are falling to some extent, that's true. And it's partly because, a combination of things, it's too expensive to live there and too expensive to commute there. Something has to give, and they're not going to drop the rail prices. So in that case, I think the only buying really that's going on, and this is not the only buying, but a major part of the buying, is foreign buying. And that's now becoming targeted to some extent. We may actually see some government policy in that, like the ones that the Canadians have brought in. But it's still, massively more expensive than it was. And I'm looking at a nominal index here, so I won't go too far back in the nominal index. But if you go back to 2000, the nominal house index, and for using the Bank of International Settlements data, which sets the index at 100 in 2010, it was 50 in 2000. So that's doubling the nominal value over the to 2010. And now, across the entire country, it's 130. And that house prices fell after, when the crisis hit. They fell from a peak index value in 2008 of 110. They fell down to 90. So it's something in the order of a 20% fall. But since that's when QE began. And QE, I think, has been a large reason why we've got house prices have continued rising. People who've made share market gains by selling shares to companies that had to buy shares because the government bought bonds off them, yada, yada, yada. That's now helped house prices rise to the stage where they're, 30%, 40% higher than they were at the end of the downturn. But what's also happening, and this is where I expect domestic buying to run out at some stage, household debt in the UK peaked at about 96% of GDP back in 2010. It fell to 85%. It's now rising. It's about 87%, not rising by much, but that's adding some extra potential demand impetus. Probably not in London itself, because of the peculiar issues of London, house prices being 3 times the rest of the country and the cost of commuting there being impossible as well. Something has to give in that market. But the rest of the UK could start seeing its house prices rising a bit, I think, courtesy of this extra demand pressure coming in now. Though it can't go particularly far because, again, with just a rise of a bit over 10% of GDP, you're back at levels that are literally the highest England's ever had.
But how can they? Apart from, and you hinted at it, the fact that, there's foreign buyers, how can houses, like anything, get above a price that people are prepared to pay for them? Surely that they reach a point where people go, well, I can't afford this anymore, I'm not going to buy it. Obviously we've had low interest rates for a while, so people have a false idea of how much they can afford. But surely the market's going to determine if you can't afford to buy it, you're not going to buy it. Therefore, the price is going to come down.
Well, it's a positive feedback, because if you don't just buy houses to live in, unfortunately, you buy them also to gamble on. And therefore, if house prices are rising, that actually adds to demand. If you have rising price of carrots, that doesn't add to the demand for carrots. So assets are very, very different. People buy because they see the prices rising, and there's a positive feedback between the two, and that's why it's dangerous. That's why it needs to be controlled. But in that can go on, and it has gone on. It's driven, UK household debt levels has trebled them in the last 30 years. But of course, when you get to this high level, what actually keeps house prices rising isn't the level of debt. It's partially the rate of change of debt, but it's also the rate of change of the rate of change of debt. And this is why it gets very tricky. But the basic logic, and I've done the mathematics on this and also some of the empirical work for the United States with two colleagues, Paul Omerund and Rickard. If you think about what is the demand for housing, fundamentally, when we're talking domestic purchases, it's the flow of new mortgages. So that's the rate of change of mortgage debt is the flow of new mortgages divided by the price level. And that's going to be roughly equal to the flow of supply in the market, which is houses being turned over for all sorts of reasons, from divorce to people trying to capitalise on gains to people moving, plus the rate of change of housing stock that's being added, houses being demolished and new ones being added. So you've got a relationship between the change in mortgage debt and the level of house prices. So your main driver is therefore the change in housing debt, which is the change in new mortgages and the rate of change of house prices. And the UK's case, using data going back to 1970, according to economic theory, I should find a correlation of 0. It's conventional economic theory. The data gives me a correlation of 0.56. So if you want to slow down, if you want to reduce house prices, the main thing you've got to do is reduce the rate of growth of mortgage debt.
It sounds like it's spiraling out of control. However bad it is now, it's getting worse all the time. But I mean, if you try and do anything about it, that is going to hurt the economy.
Yeah, it does, and this is the catch-22. I mean, I often think about we should we should do this analogy one day, but it reminds me of the very first episode of Alien. You'll see the classic Sigourney Weaver first issue of Alien, when they try to take that thing off John Hurt's face, and they tentatively the creature's over his face. For those who haven't seen the movie, and they try to use a pair of pliers, I think, to break one of the limbs. It breaks one of the limbs, the blood in the animal falls out and goes straight through 3 or 4 levels of the hull of the ship. And somebody then says, interesting defense mechanism, you don't dare kill it. Well, that's fundamentally the housing market, because when you have the extent to which people have speculated on it and their apparent net worth is based on inflated house prices versus the level of debt they've purchased to buy them, if house prices start to fall, there's panic everywhere. Not everywhere, panic amongst those who bought the houses, and then when the slowdown in the rate of growth of new mortgages occurs, there's a slowdown in the rate of growth of the money supply as well, and GDP falls. Yeah. Do you know, when I was watching that movie, I was thinking that it's just like the housing market. That I remember. Absolutely,
I remember commenting to the person.
I was about 20. Yeah.
That's right. Look, so what about affordable housing then? We've got Sajid Javid, who's the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government. He's the guy responsible, supposedly, for making sure people can afford to buy houses. His answer is that people can't afford houses because young people are spending too much on nights out and smashed avocado at breakfast. They're not facing.
He hasn't been hit by avocados when he walks down the street.
Well, he says they're not young people, not facing up to the reality of modern daily life. They have no understanding of the modern market, he says, something they have in common with him.
He has no understanding, exactly.
By the sounds of it.
The level of say, I mean, when you're looking at mortgages, if you've still got £500,000, then to actually purchase one of those places, you've got to be saving at least, if you're looking at 10% these days, 10% deposit. The amount of time people take to save effectively what is 2 years' income for many young people is they're not young people anymore what they can afford to buy.
No.
A particular point, this is partly your question, can this go on forever? What I would like to use as a way of analysing this is effectively an epidemiological model. That's a hard one to say on a Sunday morning, because when you look at how a disease spreads, and that's also a good analogy to the house prices, then you have a population of non-infected, a population of infected, and a population of recovered. And in this case, the infected are those people who have already bought a house. The non-infected are the ones who haven't yet bought a house. And the recovered are ones who've sold a house. Now, if you start off with, like say, you begin with, say, with 0% home ownership, then when somebody buys a house, let's say you do a population of 100, then you now have 99% availably infected and 1% infected. And if you keep on going 10, 20, 30, 40, 50%, ultimately you get to the point where the number of people who can be infected and add to those with the disease already is less than half the population. So that epidemiological logic means that you start running out of people who can afford to get into the disease, the market. And I think that's partly what would actually stop this happening, where the government's getting caught up in policy. On the other side, the government, particularly Australian government's the classic instance, of course, they start seeing house prices as the be-all and end-all, and they do everything they can to keep the prices going.
Well, I mean, and of course, it becomes a contentious issue, and certainly, the reason why I wanted to talk about this is because it's becoming a contentious issue now, and the Treasurer, Philip Hammond, and Sajid Javid are saying, well, we have to find policy answers to all of this. But how big is the issue? So I look at... there's one thing, people can't afford to buy a house, which, maybe they need to rent, and we can look at that in a second. But the other thing is, what if you just can't afford to pay and then your house gets repossessed? House repossessions are pretty close to an all-time low in the UK at the moment. They're well below 2,000 a quarter. They did get up to 12,000 a quarter in 2009. But even then, that's a very small proportion of the total population defaulting on their mortgages and getting their houses repossessed. So is that a big issue, or is the bigger issue just the fact that people can't afford to buy houses?
Well, it's becoming a political issue, because certainly when I'm speaking now to young groups of young people around the country, that is becoming more and more something they're actually quite politically pissed off by. And they will ultimately become more than half the population, because I'm not sure the average age with which house purchases occur now, but it certainly isn't in your 20s anymore. So you're getting everybody over 18 up to a certain age group. You're then talking half the voting population. Once you get anywhere near that, then you get a political possibility that rather than having political parties seeing their role as keeping house prices rising, there may be political capital in saying we're going to get them down and actually mean it.
Right, but you know what, though? It is those, young people eating their smashed avocados, and also the expectation that they're going to have a house with an indoor toilet. If it was good enough for us to have an outdoor denny at the end of the garden, they've just got to get realistic expectations, haven't they?
That's partly it, but it's also when you have a rise in the level of urban agglomerations like London. I mean, again, if you go back 30 years, I'm not sure what London's population was then, but these days it's supposed to be 14 million. The scale of the agglomeration and the transport system also becomes an issue. So if you have people living on the periphery of London who are told, and who work anywhere near the centre, then they face massive transportation costs as well. They start looking at it and thinking, I'm either, if I buy out here, I can't afford to commute in. And I think in that particular case, London's got a very peculiar problem, because it's got, I would imagine, I'm not sure, but I imagine one of the most expensive public transportation systems in the world. And at that level, it becomes catch-22. You can't afford to rent, you can't afford to buy, and you can't afford to work in London, so you might as well eat smashed avocados.
Exactly, yeah, on the dole. But what, just once a week, because that's all you could afford, probably. But I mean, in that scenario, wouldn't companies say, well, okay, we can't afford to operate in these circumstances because the workforce are demanding so much money to cover all of these costs, we should move out of London. And that's what the whole Thames corridor, that's how, around Reading, places like that started to see industry growing up. We're not seeing that. We're not seeing that so much in Australia because there's no transport infrastructure out of the big cities, and all the secondary cities strangely are allowed to basically die. But here, there is that opportunity for regional development.
I think that's possible, and because it's a pretty clumsy way to deal with expensive housing. But yeah, that's certainly feasible, because, and I look at the cost of just even a simple, urban journey in London, 20 kilometres will cost you £7 one way. It's just crazy expensive compared to income. So if the people can't afford to travel, then the companies are going to have to do it. And that's, again, as I said, a pretty crazy way to cope with expensive housing.
Well, the other way, according to the Chancellor, and also Sajid Javid has said the same thing as well. In fact, I think it's fairly accepted wisdom, but you're going to tell me, no doubt, that that's wrong. Increased supply. Sajid Javid said we need 300,000 additional homes in England each year, which is twice what it was a couple of years ago. It was about 215,000 last year. So is that the answer to affordable housing? Just build more? And if that is the case, why isn't that just happening anyway? Why aren't market forces making it happen?
No, several reasons. One is because the dynamics are quite complicated, because if you look at the flow of supply for housing, as I said, it's turnover of existing properties plus new ones being built. And that itself is related to the house price level. When you take a look at the change in house prices, then it's the change in the number of houses coming onto the market and the acceleration of house building. So it's the second order effect. The acceleration changes much more rapidly than the rate of change. So if you're driving a car, the acceleration forces are the ones if you hit the brake and hit the accelerator and you're at in the medium range for the car, that's when you feel the forces forwards and backwards. Same sort of story for acceleration here. So house prices could plunge if the acceleration got too high, and that in that situation, it is not a decent control mechanism, and it's one of the reasons I think politicians talk about it, is they know they can talk about it, wring their hands, and walk away and ignore the issue later.
Right. So if I'm hearing you right, what you're saying is, if he's saying, well, we're going to keep house prices or make house prices affordable because we're going to build 300,000 additional homes this year, then to keep them low, he's going to have to build 400,000 the year after, and 550,000 the year after that, and then 750 the year after that, and a million the year after that. Otherwise, the moment he slows down, then the house prices are going to start creeping up again.
Yeah, but it's also the price. It's really the price of land. I mean, there's a couple of issues here which are real issues, and it's one of the few things I like in Ricardo is the argument about what causes the rents to be the level they are, and it also relates to land prices as well. So as you develop a country, build a city like London, a lot of the increase in prices just due to the fact that it's becoming more dense in population. And anybody who's bought early does very nicely because the price rises as the population rises. That's a classic Ricardian effect. You've got to get out of that. The only way you can get out of that is by taxing the increase in the value of the land. But that's about as popular as polio. So it's rather a hard one to implement. But of course, what's the new line called the Queen Elizabeth line being built across London right now?
Yeah, the East-West link. Yeah.
That's going to drastically increase the value of properties along that line. Did the people who are benefiting from that actually do anything themselves to increase the value of their properties? No, they're basically siphoning off the increased property value. So the argument about land taxes say, well, we're going to tax the increase in the value of the land caused by activities which have got nothing to do with what the local owner has done. Now, if you bring that in, it's the sort of thing that the Henry George crowd have been on about for a long, long time. That is a way to stop that house price rises happening, because, of course, if you've got to pay a capital gains tax on a property, then you've got to finance it out of your income, and suddenly it's not so easy to cover that mortgage anymore. So you would have a fairly high likelihood of dropping the level of house prices by doing that. Now, again, I think that's got zero chance of being implemented in the current political environment.
Well, that raises another question, whether it's because the new rail line's been built or, there's new facilities paid for by the local council. People do their sums, don't they, to find out what the maximum they can afford is. If council rates are high, then people can afford less, and so perhaps that means property prices will fall. It means money is that the developers were going to get now goes to the councils. In which case, would councils charging more actually help contain house prices? It doesn't make anybody better off. It just means the money shifts hands as to who the beneficiary is.
Yeah, and it has to be based on the value of the land rather than how many bedrooms you have, which is the crazy situation you and I both know applies in the UK.
Well, let's look at another factor that influences demand, and you mentioned it yourself, foreign buyers. And if we look at Kensington and Chelsea, the borough where the Grenfell Tower took place, there are said to be over 1,600 empty properties just in that one London borough, and they are predominantly property speculators from overseas.
I know, it's obscene. One of my colleagues, Rex McKenzie, is starting to do work on that. And basically arguing there's a causal link. If you have councils that are so cash strapped because there's so many empty properties, and I think they charge people 1.5 times the council tax rate for having a property empty. Make it 10. But if 1.5 times, that's why you decide to save 6,000 quid by cladding Glenfell in flammable material.
Yeah, by the way, I don't think Kensington and Chelsea are short of money. I mean, they may have got. I think they're one of the wealthiest councils in the country, if not the wealthiest.
But they spent it doing making the outside of poor buildings look good for the rich people. They don't they don't build more buildings themselves.
Yeah.
So it's quite appalling how these two things are interlinked. And if you actually, because we've allowed households to turn into speculative assets rather than places to live, and people then buy them and leave them literally empty for the sheer pleasure of seeing the house price rise over time. That, if even if they can even not maintain the buildings, which of course happens on occasions, it's an appalling way to manage a country.
So do you then, therefore, try and limit demand? Do you say, well, if you buy a house, you've got to live in it. If you're a foreign buyer, you've got to live in this country. Do you try and limit the demand for housing in that way?
There are some arguments for foreign buying of properties. Because you do have executives who fly between countries, you do have people who buy a holiday house somewhere and actually use it as such, et cetera, et cetera. So you do need to allow some sensible level of that. But I think the French had a rule at one stage where no more than 10% of the housing stock could be sold to foreign buyers.
Yeah.
And something of that order, and you talk more than 10% of your housing, people who don't live there, that you're clearly getting extreme. If it's getting beyond that, in places like Chelsea, I think it's something in the order of 30%.
Mm. Yeah, well, Australia used to do it too. I think for new properties. Well, I mean, that is it's interesting. People, I noticed on social media, people have been saying, what a great job New Zealand's done in stopping foreign buyers. But actually, in the last budget, but all they've done actually is what Australia's done. Foreign buyers can't buy new properties. They can just can buy new properties. Sorry, they can't buy established dwellings. Mm. But all of these measures, if we're limiting foreign buyers, we're limiting the potential universe for buying property. Is that going to hold prices or keep them down, or is it not having, or is it overplayed? Is it really not having that much impact?
I think the main one to look at there is Vancouver, and apparently when they put a substantial tax on foreign purchases of properties, that's what took the wind out of the Vancouver house price bubble,
right.
Which is still substantial, but that does seem to have an impact. And of course, the other thing is, what you're beholden to what's happening in political policy in the country in which the foreigners are coming. So, if you had anything happening with Russian oligarchs, and they suddenly felt safer in Russia and stopped buying these properties, or if China cracks down properly on foreign money transfers because they're worried about their accumulated foreign reserves, then suddenly the buying pressure disappears. So it becomes something where you're worried about the house price level. You're not worried about the house as a place for people to live. We have to get back to the stage where we treat it as a consumption item, not an investment item.
So what about the provision of council housing, where you say, well, okay, there's a lot of people who can't afford rent or certainly can't afford to buy. The council is going to provide. They're going to give them housing at a knockdown rent. Does that have any impact on the rest of the housing market? Surely at some point people are going to say, well, yeah, I mean, if it's so cheap to do that, how can we charge more to rent out for our house?
Yeah, and that's one of the, I think, major mistakes the UK made under Maggie Thatcher was to abolish that system and reduce the number of council flats, because let's talk about that well-known socialist country, Singapore, which has a huge amount of public provision of housing, and from what I've seen, hasn't quite had the same house price bubble the rest of the world has had, even though the housing there is expensive. It's closer to incomes. So it's quite possible to make a social decision about the provision of property. And one thing I actually am curious about, what was the impact of this? Most of the house price level is actually the price of the land you're buying it on. Nonetheless, there's a construction factor there. Mm. And there's also the speed of construction is an issue. It's applied just very slowly. But 3D printing of housing looks like it's going to take off in the next 10 years. And what would happen if you could build a block of council flats at one flat per day? At a cost of about 10 to 20,000 quid to build the entire thing. If that starts happening, I think we could see some really interesting dynamics on this market, which I would thoroughly enjoy seeing.
Well, I mean, when you talk about it being related to the value of the land, I mean, the value of the land obviously is exactly the same as the house and the land together. It's whatever the demand is at that time. So if the council builds a lot of council houses, and say a quarter of a town is now council houses, the other 3/4, whether irrespective of the land value is going to be held back as much as the whole house and land together, because people are paying less rent because a quarter of the population is in council housing.
Yeah, and it takes the sting out of the market as a speculative issue, and that's what we need.
Right. So better doing that than the idea, Sajid Javid's idea, that we just need more and more houses built. And I guess the other thing as well, and we've spoken about this many times in the past, the idea that we'll help people get on the housing market with the first home buyers grant, which you've called the first home vendors grant, because it basically just pushes prices up. And now we've got this crazy idea from the Chancellor about abolishing stamp duty.
Well, that's actually a point you made a moment ago about taxation and council tax. If you do that, it'll go into the house price.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You don't want to do that.
So the other thing that went wrong with council houses was the idea of selling them, because that sort of negate. People complain about the fact that they were sold and never replaced, but isn't part of the problem the idea that they're sold in the first place? Because then people
exactly, because this is one of Maggie Thatcher's reforms that I think the UK will look back and rue very badly, because that's what enabled the growth of the private debt to take off. Because that, when I look at the data, and 1982 is the crucial date when private debt, which had never exceeded 73% of GDP in the UK, went from 55% over Maggie Thatcher and Tony Blair's reign, from 55% to 195% of GDP. And it was apparently a large institutional factor was Maggie deregulating the finance for housing, so that rather than building societies providing it, and building society then does not create money and therefore doesn't add to asset price levels, deregulated, led the commercial banks in there, and that's when the house price bubble really started.
So the other idea of local councils try is housing commission schemes. I guess they don't work either. The idea where you buy part of a house, the local authority buys the rest. You each benefit if prices go up. Then you're buying that again for.
It's actually helping inflate the bubble.
Yeah, exactly. So the only answer, but it seems like a sensible answer, and it would certainly be not the approach that's taken by this government, is that if you're looking at housing affordability, it's just look at the idea of holding prices by making sure a reasonable proportion of the total housing stock are council houses. Don't, people who are moving into those houses just having to accept the fact that, you're probably never going to own a house in your life, but do you need one? If you can't afford to buy, stay in this council house. Treat it as though it's your own, because you're going to have it for life, probably.
And that's the situation in Germany again, and this is where Germany, one of the few lessons Germany has the rest of the world can learn from. I've been told by colleagues recently there is a house price bubble developing in Germany now, which isn't amazing because the banks are totally deregulated, but German rental situation is that once you rent somewhere, it's pretty much your property until you can't be kicked out. The house can't be flipped on you, and in the house contract, you're expected to provide the kitchen. Yeah. I don't not the knives and forks. I mean the whole damn.
Yeah. Getting it fitted, absolutely. Yeah. So there we are. So that is a house for life. So I mean, if you're in a council house, and you're thinking, well, I do want to buy, and you do get to a circumstance where you can buy. Well, hopefully the fact that there's just so many council houses has brought down the private market as well. So perhaps there'll be more chance to do that.
Yeah, but I also think we need to change the regulations on lending to stop to look at the current ceiling ratio of house loans to house prices, and that, like in the UK, that might be running at something like 20 to 1 in terms of a ratio of the income the house earns to the rental income the house got to the price. The price could be 10, 20 times the current rent. Set that at a max. Leave it at the maximum now, and reduce that by a factor of 1 every year. So you get back to the stage where ultimately the maximum you can borrow to buy a property is 10 times as rental income, not 20. And in that situation, I think we'd see house prices falling, which would be, politically, you have to prepare the country for that sort of thing, because we're so locked into believing house prices should rise and always do rise, that when they start reversing, the stampede out of an inflating asset could be pretty dangerous.
Yeah. So it is. I mean, politically, it's very difficult, isn't it? We're going to push up government spending because we're going to buy all these houses, build all these houses for low rent, and in doing that, we're going to devalue your property values. And we want to win the election.
The best thing about going are the smashed avocado eaters.
Go after them. All right, very good. Okay, excellent. Another problem solved. All we need to do now is implement it as policy. Good to talk again, Steve.
Okay, mate.